The Butterfly's Dream by Kerberos 314, Chapter 14, Metaphorical. This is so awesome, I can't believe I'm going to begin with my little sis. The volume, or more likely the thought, made Ruby wince. Her enrollment had not been a foregone conclusion, and her father had been more than a little reluctant to let her attend, even with both Osmond and the board of directors for the hospital approving her. She had to wonder how many strings the headmaster pulled to get that to happen. Huntsmen and huntresses had to be rigorously screened for mental suitability, and she was pretty sure her little vacation should have left a permanent blank mark on her record. Yeah, it's pretty great, isn't it? Even then, she would be lying if she said she wasn't a little pleased to finally be moving on with her life. Maybe the story would have a happy ending after all. Of course it is. Oh, I just know everyone's gonna love you. They're going to think you're the bee's knees. She wasn't as hopeful as her sister, but at the same time did not want to spoil her good mood. Beacon was a much different place than the closely knit community at Signal, and even there her prodigal status set her apart, not always in a good way. What would her fellow students think should they learn of where she had been for the last 2 years? Of course, in the past she rarely cared about the opinions of others. Even now she could count few that mattered on one hand and have room to spare. Strange, though she hadn't so much as acknowledged that other in all the time in between. Now here on the precipice of something grand and frightening, his influence on her life could not be ignored. Muscling past all the mind-numbing logic which questioned whether or not she had just imagined him, she yet desired to know one thing. Would he be happy for her? "Hey, who's that?" Glinda Goodwitch, though the hologram informed them as much just moments after her inner voice it did. Funny, she'd never stopped to consider, but that voice in her head had never been her own, always a symphony of male and female, which spoke more deliberately and grandiosely than her whiny pubescent voice could ever manage. A narrative voice by Ruby Rose sounded silly to her. The spiel delivered from Galanta's recorded image passed her by as she continued to stare nostalgically out the window, looking at those skyscrapers of Vale, which had once been as magical as the castles in her bedtime stories. They had since been spoiled. Maybe magic itself had betrayed her. A timid hand on her shoulder, so uncharacteristic of Yang that she almost didn't recognize the touch on her own hand, darted to Crescent Rose in a Pavlovian instinct. "It's good to have you back, Ruby." She looked back at the morose expression on her sister's face. Brimming with pent-up emotion, she forgot the older teen even possessed. She returned the cautious smile, placing her smaller hand on top of the other and giving it a gentle squeeze. Did Yang think she was upset with her for her part in the temporary exile? Was she? Ignoring that question, she could never bring herself to hate anyone, much less her older sibling who'd always been there for her through thick and thin. Actions may ultimately define a person, but she still placed a lot of importance on the intangibility quality, intent. Ow! Therefore, it wasn't intentional that her seemingly frail hand clamped down on her sister's to the point where joints popped like firecrackers. No, this was just a perfectual natural response to seeing a ghost. "It can't be," she whispered to herself, aghast as the spectre glided through the crowd. "Coming through. Ew, gross." Thankfully, the distraction of vomit spilled from the rude interruption allowed Yang to leap back and rescue her hand before any permanent damage was done. The physical shock was also enough to shove Ruby out of her myopia and realize that while there was an uncanny resemblance in the disheveled blonde hair and flash of blue eyes, the young male was far too tall. There was lankiness where there should have been compact muscles, evasiveness where there should have been confidence, and ignorance when there could have been no question. Letting out a sigh of relief, which was mimicked by her sister, who had finished checking herself for spillage. She didn't believe in fate. That being said, life seemed to like screwing with her in ordinary ways. Here, brat. Naruto shook away the heady stars encroaching on his vision on that absently hot afternoon, looking up to see the refreshing treat being offered to him. Thanks, he replies hesitantly, retrying the gaggly colored popsicle from Jiraiya's massive paw. Why don't you take a break? At least wait until the sun goes down and it's cooled off a little. Naruto nodded and soon joined his master on the filled tree trunk where they sat in relative silence while taking slow leaks from their respective confections. Relative because although no words were exchanged between them, there was a mute conversation shot back and forth, and tension which built the considerable gesture. I gotta say, you weren't quite what I expected. That wasn't what he expected. Eh, what do you mean by that, you old pervert? He grew worried as the man did not leap to correct the fact he was actually a super pervert. Jiraiya just smiled softly, looking at the weeping popsicle in his hand in nostalgia. You do a good job of keeping secrets, even from yourself. Naruto felt his face drop at his declaration, ignoring the milk dripping over his fingers as his own snake stack went neglected, and despite the sweltering heat, a chill ran up his spine. You really seemed like you were a happy-go-lucky kid, just like I'd heard. Jiraiya sighed, pausing to take an apathetic lick. Maybe you even think you are, or want to be. I suppose that's better than most these days. His weary smile faltered. But it's not enough. Not if you want to live up to that nindo you keep spouting. Not if you want to conquer that cycle of hatred. He muttered the last part mostly to himself, but obviously didn't care if Naruto heard him. "What are you getting at, Jiraiya?" His question was stark, cold as the ice box the man had likely retrieved the frozen treats from. The sage paused, frowning deeper as he looked over at Naruto's severe stare, tinged with fear. "Don't worry, I didn't read those notes you think that you keep secret." Naruto choked and nearly let the plywood stick out of his grip. Jiraiya huffed a small laugh. "Can't say I'm not impressed, though. Didn't think a brat like you'd have brains enough to think up a new code that even I couldn't break, albeit not like I tried all that hard." Naruto began breathing again, relief drooping as he realized that the majority of his popsicle had melted away in his distraction, like all that was solid in his life disappearing into thin air. He felt kind of bad about that. It was obvious the old man had meant it as something endearing, but it was still his fault for dragging something so inflammatory to the surface. "At first I thought they were letters to a girl," Jiraiya chuckled, and Naruto let out a sweat drop that had nothing to do with the heat precipitated by how close he was to the truth. "Still not entirely certain it's not, but whatever it is, I can tell it's what's distracting you." It was true, even if he wasn't writing as frequently as he used to, hardly at all, considering Ruby never wrote back or indicated that she was watching anymore. It still loomed high in his mind, eclipsing most of his accomplishments, being taught the shadow clone technique, and the secret which made it such a leverage learning tool had barely kept him ahead of the curve. So considerable an obstacle was his occupation with his other worldly counterpart. The preoccupation transferred over into all those solid copies, and when time came to absorb all of their knowledge, the extraneous thoughts too came along for the ride. Having all those minds was useless if none of them could focus on a task. "I really don't know what I can say to help you here, if you aren't willing to share it with me," Jiraiya conceded, also gazing at his barren sticks with mild disgust. "I realize that I haven't given you much reason to rely on me, but I just want you to know, kid, that I understand the pain you're going through. Some of it, anyway." He turned to Naruto's guarded gaze, trying to reach out to that yearning boy he could see still strapped behind the defensive wall. "Whether it's about a woman, a promise, a missed opportunity, hell, even a man, won't judge. Believe me when I say that you can't let the what ifs rule you. You've got to live your life going forward, seize every day, though I'm not saying you have to do it like me. One of has to be halfway one of us has to be halfway responsible after all." Now this did eke out a reluctant smile on the blonde. "But my advice is still the same. Regrets will only drag you down. They'll tie you to your failings and keep you drowning in the past. Only ghosts live down there, kid. Angry ghosts and the curse of repeating history." Naruto? Hmm? His teammates looked at him concernedly, rightfully so, considering he was just toying with the ramen in front of him and letting the precious food cool to the point of becoming a soggy, inevitable mess. Are you okay? Neji asked him as if he just witnessed him losing an arm. Oh yeah, fine, believe it. He gave their skeptical looks a toothy smile, one which he extracted from the genuine happiness found in that same memory so it wouldn't quite be called fake. Just thinking about stuff. Neither of them looked particularly accepting of this answer, but knew that they were not going to pry the story from the blonde if he didn't want them to. That had been something they'd all learned the hard way after working together after being apart for so long. Naruto felt guilty giving them that sort of tacit ultimatum, especially since they'd chosen to have the celebration meal for Neji's joining promotion at Ichiraku's. He could have placated himself with the notion that it was also his return celebration after almost 2.5 years apart, but that didn't help much. I'm good, guys, really. His smile relaxed, which ironically made them do so as well. It was far more genuine than the obligatory shit eating grin he'd worn even after the Chunin exams. And it was the truth, at least the way he saw it. He was happy, adequately happy, reliving the recent trip with Jiraiya. He wasn't fool enough to ignore the familial way the man treated him during its course. Despite hiding behind his vices and aloof instruction, he knew the man was trying to make up for something lost time, perhaps. In any case, trying to follow the advice he gave Naruto that day, trying to live for the now, for the future. He still didn't know exactly where his future would take him, where he wanted it to. It was still just so impossible to think of one where Ruby didn't fit in some way. Well, here I am, she spoke to herself, by herself. Yang had already shot off to join her friends, who had also mar- matriculated on up to the big leagues, though she hadn't gone far enough to be out of sight, her sister's iconic blonde mop always lingering in the corner of her eye as she wandered around the open courtyard, where once she might have found the nervous helicoptering a nice gesture. Now it was just another reminder how fresh those wounds were, and she didn't need to be reminded that she had no friends to speak of, not here or anyway. Not here anyway. What flimsy bonds she had made had quickly eroded when the rumor of her incarceration spread throughout the school. No one would want to be associated with the psycho girl. Hey there, she froze. Fate, karma, or whatever she wished to name it decided she didn't have enough to worry about and set about fixing that in the most obnoxious way possible. Name's John Arc. Sweet, smooth, rolls off the tongue. Ladies love it. Her mouth cracked open in disbelief, or perhaps in response to a gag reflex which was waiting for her stomach to catch up with her face. Had she been a lesser woman she would have broke out in tears right then and there. Glaring differences aside, that goofy, smiling blonde was too much of an affront to her laborious construed mental barricades. She just couldn't bear up under the obvious cheer for any length of time. No, she uh, she muttered under her breath, brushing stiffly past with a graven face the older teen who was equally taken aback with his flat denial. Okay. She would feel bad for him later when she wasn't superimposing his whisker marks on that perplexed expression. Not a good way to start her new academic life here, but she couldn't bring herself to care. She was willing to put on a brave face for the sake of those who put their faith in her, but there was a difference in doing something difficult to be courageous and doing something difficult to punish yourself. This felt like the latter, though, as anyone who has tried to get a thought out of their head can tell you, the more she tried not to think on the older boy, the more she found herself whispering his absurd introduction to herself under her breath, like a commercial jingle which was so attractive as a child, now haunting you as an adult. The background chatter became so much of a distraction that she walked right in front of a luggage cart, the cart hurriedly being pushed in her direction. Watch where you're going, you klutz. I'm sorry, she offered breathlessly, inwardly noting that whoever it was had been equally collapsed in their collision. Sorry, do you even realize what you've done? Not really, no. Life had been one big blurry headache for the past 2 years, and right now she was trying to maintain the lofty high which came from that sweet relief from pain. She frankly had no idea to what the other woman referred, other than the obvious. Her expression said as much. She must have looked stupid as she gazed up at the fuming white-haired girl from the ground with her head cocked quizzingly to the side. Uh, this is ultra-refined weapons-grade dust and extremely volatile. Were you trying to blow us up? There was no good answer to that. Maybe she was, subconscious trying to betray her like it had so many times before. She also could have gone back to the argument that it took the both of them to run into one another. She could have mentioned it was neglected to keep such materials in containers which could be opened so easily by the slightest jar. She could have pointed out that the way the girl was now waving around said vial while admonishing her was just as foolish, nay, idiotic, considering she was the owner. She as the owner ought to know better, but as she had no words, everything was all just too new for her, too much for her whitewashed mind, which had been deprived of stimuli for so long in the foolish hope that it would discourage her from making any more imaginary friends. Wait, where are you going? I haven't dismissed you yet. The other girl's voice lashed indignant and inflammatory remarks as she walked away mechanically, her social skills on temporary shutdown. There would be a slight flinch when an explosion sounded behind her touched off her battle-honed instincts, something they couldn't completely override, much to Osmond's and her relief, and mused the crimson cloak around her shoulders. Apart from that, she wouldn't even notice the other raven-haired girl with the bow slink away, nor the return of her sister, who fell seemingly into step with her while pretending she hadn't been moments away the whole time. So, make any new friends? Yang cringed at the look she was getting. Even she could feel the inanity in her question. Well, you never know until you try. She tried to recover ungracefully. After a good minute of a guilt-ridden lip bite from Yang, Ruby relented with a sigh. Maybe I'll have better luck later. Both could sense the feebleness in that promise. Before, Ruby might have bonded with people over her obsession with weapons during a good-natured spar. It had obviously been a while since she'd been allowed to do that. During her involuntary stay, Yang had taken care of Crescent Rose, so since weapons weren't allowed at the recovery center, she was pretty sure that was the only reason Ruby was even talking to her right now. She should simply be glad that her juvenile sister hadn't yet drawn her weapon for one reason or another. What had been a twitchy trigger finger before must surely be painful lust by now from abstaining for so long, and there was pity for whoever broke that reluctant chastity. Just promise me you'll try, okay? She asked weakly, too weakly for the stronger woman. Ruby stopped walking and turned halfway back, biting her lip in the same way her sister and mother did when they were facing a burdensome task. Nodding slightly for her sister's relief, Ruby turned away. It wouldn't be fair to Yang if she didn't at least try, otherwise the older girl would carry her guilt for the rest of her life, follow her like a mother hen, and grow up resentful because she never had the chance to live her life. No, Ruby was not inclined to be a burden, and if that meant taking more on for herself, so be it. It's like a big slumber party. Ruby stopped muffling her doggy pillow and looked around as if she hadn't already scoped out every corner of the grand ballroom upon entering. She shrugged, agreeing half-heartedly. She couldn't remember having many slumber parties when she was a kid, so maybe she was too young or off doing her own thing, living vicariously for herself. Cutting that thought short, she returned to her mindless task and attempted to think on the unusual short speech Osmond had just given them. Trying to remember why it sounded familiar. Back then, she'd had a second chance to remind herself of such things, but those days were gone. Gotta say, as so far I'm not minding the diversity. Yang filled the empty space in the conversation as she leisureusly ogled the half-naked males. Truthfully, she was just trying to spark a reaction from her sister. Such selection. Though I might just have to start marking my territory here. What do you think, Ruby? Any in particular I should leave for you? The girl looked at her elder with an almost scathing look, which was a far cry from the stuttering blush that Yang was expecting. I think that you shouldn't treat them like pieces of meat. You wouldn't want them to do the same, would you? Okay. Yang conceded instantly, not knowing where this attitude had come from, but certainly she didn't want to be on the other side of it. Just a joke, right? Don't have to tell that on me. Deflection at the mention of her father, which only threatened to sour her mood further. Ruby nodded curtly and turned back to gathering her toiletries. She knew that she was overreacting, both to the mention of her parent and to the obvious good-natured remark by her elder sister. To get upset like that wasn't her. It wasn't even a relic left from her other persona. It was a perversion of the worst parts of each, and it disgusted her, but she couldn't help it in her current muddled state. "I'm going to brush my teeth," she informed, while trying not to sound brut- brisk. "Right." Yang considered following her sister. Didn't. Just watched her sister walk away alone. "Hey!" Ruby froze on her way to the bathroom, fist clenched and head bowed as she considered the accosting voice from the dark corner where only candlelight flickered. She was tired, tired of that day and all the hoops she had to jump through, tired in general, and just wanted to go to bed and let her dream identity continue with his happy reunion so that one of them might enjoy their confuddled life. "What?" she asked, with more irritation than she knew was warranted. Chatoyant eyes blinked in the darkness. "Sorry," the silky voice said without inflection. "You were that girl from before, right? The one yelled at by the Schnee. I just wanted to know if you were all right. You looked pretty out of it afterwards." Ruby considered the other girl's words. Though she didn't know what a Schnee was, it was clearly a genuine gesture of concern. She might have been tired and cranky, but she also knew a prime opportunity to make a friend when he was presented to her on a silver platter. "I'm fine, thanks." She bowed her head a little in the direction of the glowing eyes and candles. "Oh, I'm Ruby, by the way. Blake. So, Blake." She walked closer to the small vigil, regarding her new acquaintance in the soft of light. "Watched reading a book?" Ruby could tell that the older girl was hesitant, now that she realized her token of politeness had jeopardized her carefully secured solitude. "I like books. My mom used to read to me all the time." She looked wistfully to the ceiling before Silver Eye snapped back to the candlelight. "Is it good?" She slid in next to the black-haired woman, trying to appear as inoffensive as possible. Not a hard thing to accomplish, as her frail-looking body had not improved in that prison-like institution. "Yeah," Blake answered, with less reluctance than before, more at ease, talking about a subject she was familiar with. Ruby knew that feeling. "What's it about?" She gently closed the text and turned it over to the cover, which was so well worn that not one word could have been made out. And yet those piercing yellow eyes seemed to pick out even the barest gold flakes in the encroaching darkness. "It's about a man with two souls. Faith, seriously. Loved to screw with her." "I really must thank you, Miss Rose." "Why?" There was just the barest hint of hope in the otherwise dead question, which Osmond seemed to contemplate for a moment before answering. "Because in these past months you never once divulged my secret, even under the oath of confidentiality. You never even hinted at it, nor me except when asked directly. Didn't want to know about the truth, only about my lies," she responded unhesitantly, staring at the cold tile floor, not bothering to question how he would know the content of a private session. "You really believe that I told you what I told you is the truth?" "Yes." There was a language delay before the answer, in which time Osmond considered the view of the open window, open, but barred to prevent Patience from leaving. "You sound hesitant." He watched as the bird landed on the branch of an oak outside. "What part do you not trust?" Ruby quit looking at her visitor and stared at her hands, watching, feeling as they wrung out the wispy robe. "Could it be that it isn't what I told you that's the issue?" Footsteps and the clacking of a cane approached her. "Instead, you wonder on your own truth?" Naruto remembered watching her hands writhe and spasm like they were being electrocuted. Perhaps that would have been an easier torture than what they unwittingly put her through in that place. He remembered choking, even when he hadn't been breathing in the first place. He remembered it was some of the longest seconds in either of their lives. This would be the moment which, if she was going to bury him forever, she would. So tell me, what is stopping you, Miss Rose? The moment broke as a confronting hand was laid on her shoulder, enveloping completely the protuberance. I remember, not long ago, a young girl telling me about how foolish it was to judge things so quickly, how one could not simply take what was assigned by others as the truth. But how am I supposed to know what's real and what's not? All my life I've relied on others to tell me the answers, but now everyone's telling me what I know is wrong. Then you show up and tell me then you show up and tell me this crazy, unbelievable fairy tale is the truth, and for some reason I want to trust you. Why? How can I, even when everyone else is saying one thing, how can I just pick and choose what to believe? Ospen let her vent and exhaust the raw energy which had been waiting on that confession. Then he spoke the answer he had prepared so long ago. I think I'll tell you another tale. Don't worry, this is just a fun story, he amended at her distraught whine. Not long ago there was a girl, and one day she decided to take a walk through the woods just to pass the time and for no other reason. Suddenly, in the clearing ahead, she spied a unicorn. She was of course astounded and fearful that it might just be a trick of the imagination, so she daren't approach this and settled to watch it from afar. Before she knew it, the creature became spooked by something and had galloped away out of sight. Continuing her walk in a dreamlike state, she wondered whether or not it really had been just that, a dream. She couldn't possibly have seen a unicorn because they didn't exist. Yet the creature had a horn, did it not? Right there in the center of its head. The clearing was bright as day, and no shadows fell across to mislead her vision. No, in fact, the creature had turned to her for a little bit, in which she looked into its eyes, and it all but told her what it was. She had definitely seen a unicorn. Which was even more strange, for this path she had taken was one she had walked many, many times before and not seen anything. In fact, it was a very popular trail, and so it was no surprise when she happened across another traveler just a little way down the path. "You'll never believe it," the young woman said to the girl, "but just now I thought I saw a unicorn." Thus the girl was vindicated in her belief, and yet what? Halston smiled as Ruby's eyes perked up from the floor, and in that question hid the first hint of interest she'd shown in months. And yet she didn't feel any better, nor worse, than the first moment when she solidified her belief. In fact, knowing that this other woman had undoubtedly seen the same thing as she had, spoiled the miracle in her mind. But that wasn't to be the end of it, for as the two continued on side by side, they ran into more and more travelers on their journey, all of whom had seen the same unique creature, though you might never know it, because with each new encounter came a new voice of so-called reason. Someone is obviously playing a trick on us. Unicorn? Don't be daft. It's just a horn with an arrow in its head. I don't know about the horn, but it was certainly a big white horse. Horse? I thought it was a donkey. Oh, that poor beast. The people should be more careful where they practice their archery. Before she knew it, she began to doubt what she had saw not 10 minutes ago. She listened more and more to the argument now nucleated around her, and the voices using logic to disarm every thought which ran contrary to what they had already seen with their own eyes. And so, in the end, that day would fall into an ordinary truth, and no one would bother to remember the wondrous delusion which is life. Ow! Ow! Serves you right. If this had been a real battle, you'd have been saying a lot more than just ow. Naruto rubbed his behind indignantly, trying to hide the chagrin from knowing the other boy was right. Meh, you just cheated. The deadpan expression, only broken by a quirked eyebrow, pierced and deflated his artificial ire. "I still say those copycat eyes are cheating," he grumbled distantly as he accepted the afforded hand up off the ground. "You didn't seem to think so last time." Sasuke smirked and offed some clinging leaves off of his comrade's back. Nah, I thought so back then too. I just didn't say anything." Naruto straightened his jacket, but even his skin felt ill-fitted that moment. I'd have sounded like a show off. Someone has to show a little humility around here. I see. An uncomfortable silence fell between them as they stared across from one another. Uncomfortable for Naruto because he knew he had messed up what was supposed to be an epic reunion, a fight which would have echoes of their previous ones so long ago and would determine their respective progress after so long apart, a rivalry revisited now that he could finally recognize it at last for what it was. You were remembering back then, weren't you? Yeah, he might have felt bad for fibbing to his friend, but it was more a twist in words. Admittedly, not a good issue. It was a drop in the bucket compared to everything else he lived in every moment, even if Jiraiya and everyone, including himself, didn't believe it. It was just hard sometimes to know which moments he had already visited. Liar. Naruto flinched at the blunt accusation. That time, what you told me? Sasuke, too, was looking somewhere else, somewhere long since gone by. When I considered going to Orochimaru, I approached you first because of the strength you showed against Gaara, not because of any sort of false humility. Naruto rubbed the back of his head, but suddenly it felt like even that gesture was a show. And when I asked, you said to me that you'd become strong to protect your precious people. You said that my hate and anger would never surmount it, and as long as I followed that path, I would never beat you. I decided to test that theory. It was true. He'd still held hope back then, hope of fixing things through pure determination. The breeze sharpened into a gust that rent the air between them. And I lost. And it shattered. I believed you. Naruto gripped his Kusarigama. Naruto's grip on his Kusarigama slipped just so when the crimson flashing at him winked out. You proved to me that you were stronger with your conviction back then, and I decided to give it a chance. But then you went away, and I let you, with the faith and your promise that you would continue to get stronger alongside me, despite the distance between us. But that isn't what happened, is it? Where is this newfound strength you should have achieved? I was hardly lifting a finger, and yet I could have beaten you several times over since you started. So, is that it? Is this the limit of your ideal, or are you just mocking me, Uzumaki Naruto? His heart fluttered with each beat of his Inusuateru name. He thought he knew shame, but Sasuke managed to remind him that there was always something beneath that gutter he looked out from. He shook the mug from his shoulders, but couldn't yet find his way to the surface. So, are you going to keep living in the past? Because if you want to catch up, know that I'm far ahead of where you were last time. Emphasizing his point, his vision, once clenched in barely restrained fury, exploded in shower of Martian light, and that fickle breeze churned up all around. Leaves danced like the tomo in his eyes. You've lagged behind, Uzumaki. That much I can tell even without my so-called cheating eyes. There's little chance now that your ideals will ever get you to my level in time to make any difference, so maybe it's just better if you quit now and admit that you were wrong. Maybe his time away had been squandered, himself too mired in that innuendo of remembrance to take advantage of all that he did still have. Maybe the only connection he had left with Ruby was one-sided, and she had moved on from him, for whatever degree of good that was for either. The point was that she had moved on. He saw her stepping down the palisade which led to Beacon, with no small amount of trepidation. After all she had been through, all he had put her through in that horrid place they dared to call an institute of healing. No doubt she had a long road ahead, they both did, though his image might not still be there to inspire her with the strength to get back up. The thought some day her speed might outstrip the last threads of that gossamer bond between them. He was obligated not to mistreat that conviction bred during their time together. It was their inspiration, their creation, their child, and their truth, perhaps the only one they could count on. But no, there was something else he could count on now, and it was staring down at him with blazing determination to rival his own. Sasuke might have been pissed at him, and rightfully so, but it was a passion which was truly part of caring. Compassion of his hard-won comrade. Naruto was lucky to have him. He was lucky to have all of them. Tenten, Neji, Yamato, Iruka, Jiraiya, Tsunade, and so many more, and even if it was just for a time, he was lucky to have Ruby. He could only hope that she felt the same, but he would no longer dwell on the past. He never gave up a hope for a future with her once more. Now he had other people who were depending on him. Quit? Yeah, right. He felt the autumn leaves get tossed in the thermals, swirling around him, scent of fall mingling in his nostrils as they flared in a revisited gust of upheaval. This story just this story is just getting started. End of chapter 14.